or just about everybody. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ali FitzGibbon, and I'm a lecturer here at Queen's University. And I'm kind of the host of today's proceedings, but I'm going to probably talk for a couple of minutes and then pass over to to kind of start the ball rolling in terms of today's events. So what I'd like to do is first thank you all for giving up part of your Monday afternoon to come and join us, and to say on behalf of the School of Arts, English and Languages and Queen's University, I'd like to welcome you. And like many of our colleagues across the world, we're stepping into this digital space for the first time. So if we have any difficulties, please bear with us. But today is also continuing in a really important occasion in our annual calendar that was started by my former colleague, Dr. Victoria Durer in 2014, to celebrate and showcase the research emerging from our Masters in Arts Management, and then to draw together kind of communities of people around some of the topics that we're looking at. So we're very delighted to be part of the ESRC Festival of Social Sciences, and our annual showcase has been part of this since 2015. And each year we have, with their support, welcomed a range of guest speakers, this year being no different, and also students from the outgoing Masters in Arts Management to speak and present their work. We've been delighted that we've been able to engage with members of the public and attendees from the wider world of arts and culture, and I can see many names appearing today that I recognise, and also from the public and policy sector and from the community of people who are generally interested in topics of how we engage with and manage cultural and creative activities here and elsewhere. So I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping notes. We'd ask everyone who's not presenting to keep their microphones on mute and to keep their cameras off. This is just to help us with facilitating the event. I'll be introducing first, once I finish speaking, I'll introduce each of our 3 student presentations today by Tamana Karana, Fiona Lowe and Kelly Emerson, and I'm going to just go straight from one to the other rather than introduce each one separately. Then we're going to have a talk by our guest speaker today, Professor Mark Banks. And following this, I'll introduce Dr. Natalia Grincheva, who will chair a Q&A with our 4 contributors. And she'll ask some questions of her own around today's topic. But also we're asked those who are attending to post questions in the chat, either during the presentations, and then she can pick them up, or during the Q&A. Today's session, for everybody to be aware, today's session is being recorded, and each of the short presentations you're going to see from students will be released on YouTube after the event. We are delighted today to have 2 interpreters joining us, Christina Laverty and Janet Beck. And if you are requiring assistance with this, you can find them in the chat. We'll be spotlighting them throughout. And you can also pin your video and adjust the screen sizes when we're showing the videos in order to follow them. We're all by now familiar with how COVID-19 and the resulting lockdown have restricted our lives and brought the majority of creative work across the world to a halt. We're currently experiencing a disruption to patterns of work and creative expression that no one could have imagined at the start of 2020. And we've also seen how through this, creative people are already forging new and alternative vocabularies and practices. What may not have been so visible was how entire graduate and postgraduate programs and their students adjusted and adapted to the pandemic. We have heard about the shift to digital in teaching. We've heard about the closed campuses and the lockdown halls of residence. But less has emerged about how the 2020 students continued to work, continued to adapt their plans, overcame the challenges of lockdown to complete their studies. And in accomplishing this undertaking, they made new discoveries about themselves and their strengths, as well as about their topic. In the face of so much cancellation, I think it's fitting that today's event is seen as a tribute to the perseverance of our students, that they have emerged with new knowledge to offer us here today, and in their future working lives. They should be something that gives us all hope for a reimagined future. The title of today's event is a deliberate question. We bring the different contributions together today to explore the many different routes we may wish to consider for our future. For me, the work the students will present offers not only hope that there are new and better ways of thinking and working, but they demonstrate how critical thinking, persistence, revision, and inquiry are part of how we find solutions and new routes to pursue. I always think a sign of a successful discussion is to come away with more and more purposeful questions, not only answers. So I'm going to start the session by introducing each of the students' presentations, and just bear with me in my wonderful technical expertise.
Major city in North America managed to host the largest fringe festival outside of Edinburgh, the best folk festival, and would steal world-renowned touring acts from so-called global cities like Vancouver or Calgary. At the same time, I noticed how many smaller independent arts organizations were struggling.
Sorry, Ali, I think the sound's gone.
My apologies. Can you say again, please? I can't see the screen.
We can't hear anything.
Oh no. Please bear with me, guys. Should I go back to the start?
Yes, please.
I investigated the
Can you hear that okay? No,
No, we can't hear that.
Okay, let me try this again.
I investigated the relationship between a city's cultural strategy plan and independent for-profit arts businesses by using my hometown, Edmonton, Canada, as a case study. Growing up in Edmonton, I was amazed at how my hometown, the most northern major city in North America, managed to host the largest fringe festival outside of Edinburgh, the best folk festival, and would steal world-renowned touring acts from so-called global cities like Vancouver or Calgary. At the same time, I noticed how many smaller independent arts organizations were struggling. I saw an insane potential in my hometown to be a true arts and culture hub in Canada, but I knew there was a disconnect somewhere. I completed my dissertation focused on municipal cultural policy and narrowed down its relationship to one specific stakeholder, independent for-profit arts businesses. There has been decades of in-depth research in the fields of cultural policy and the creative industries, but it was harder to find research which specified how these fields relate to the for-profit arts sector, separate from the larger nonprofit sector. I completed my research by first performing a document policy analysis on the current cultural strategic plan put forward by the Edmonton Arts Council, an arm's-length organization of the City of Edmonton. These cultural strategy plans are common in most mid to large-sized cities from Edmonton to Belfast, London to Tokyo, and were popularized after theories like the rise of the creative class became trendy at the turn of the millennium. I carried out this analysis to understand the three major themes, which were the race to be a global city, change and innovation, and Indigenous inclusion. These themes were used to create questions for the interviewees, who were the owners of independent arts businesses in Edmonton. One interviewee owned a for-profit theater company, and the other owned a music production company. In the past, both had been contracted to work for the City of Edmonton, and both were aware of the Edmonton Arts Council, but neither had read or even heard of the plan, connections, and exchanges. Still, both interviewees had strong opinions to the major themes that were analyzed from the plan. They truly believed in the importance of the cultural strategy plans, despite the fact that they did not read them. A key reason was they found it difficult to access due to it being a 160-page document, and also because they were unaware of who the plan was written for. Regardless, they both expressed interest in being involved in these types of plans in the future. One key sentiment that both interviewees expressed was an odd dichotomy of being an independent arts business where the arts community does not view them as being artsy enough, and at the same time, they're viewed as not business enough in other professional settings. It's clear there's an opportunity to develop a better relationship between independent arts businesses and the creators of the cultural strategic plans, arts councils. My research found that these businesses do want to play a more active role in the cultural planning in their cities. Beyond just financial support, the cultural policy and planning that comes from cultural strategic plans are important. They're important to these businesses, the policymakers, and most importantly, developing this relationship could genuinely create more self-sustaining, vibrant, thriving artistic cities. Thank you.
We're going to move straight to the next video, which is from Fiona Lowe.
My name is Fiona and I am an artist. When I started out painting, I realised that I could see plenty of females in the paintings on display of prestigious galleries, but where were the paintings by female artists? I investigated this and found a survey which revealed that out of 26 prominent art galleries in America, women artists made up only 14% of exhibitions from 2008 to 2018. Similar statistics recur throughout the world, so I wanted to find out why. I researched literature on museum studies and women artists, and then carried out a case study locally at the Ulster Museum in Belfast. I interviewed one curator and two members of senior management. What did I find? In the Ulster Museum, only 15% of artists in the fine art collection are women. Subsequently, choices for curators are limited because of gendered collections that predate them. All this stems from the unequal position of women in art history. However, when I looked at the past year, 2018-2019, I made an interesting discovery. 29% of artworks on display were women's. This is more than twice the amount of women represented in the collection and more than twice of what was happening in major American museums over the past decade. Why is this? 2018 marked the centenary of the female vote in the UK. Such a large event was an influencing factor, but not a token year. All interviewees made it clear to me that, as a publicly funded body, the audience determines why they programme what they programme. Women make up half the population and are as equal and as creative as men. One interviewee specialises in curating women's art and drives a strong programming in group and solo shows. But how does she make this happen? She networks, researches, unearths works from storage, applies for works on loan, and acquires women's art to achieve a 30% quota, a target she has set herself. While quotas can be considered controversial, she makes it clear that this reflects the number of women making art throughout history. Any choices she makes must be selected on the basis of merit, and there's a senior committee to verify that she is doing things right. The concept of doing things right came across in all interviews. Staff made it clear that while gender is very important to them, it has to compete with other Section 75 categories for space on the walls of this multifunctioning museum. So an intersectional perspective is valued rather than a purely feminist lens. I raise this point because all three participants were women. When you hear this, maybe you are thinking that at the outset of this research, I specifically selected to interview females. Well, no. National Museums Northern Ireland employs many women and has a female CEO. Although it is not a given that female staff will change the gender balance on display, the Ulster Museum is creating change, but moderating the pace for long-term sustainability. Gender is written into the museum's collections development policy. However, it is worth exploring whether this could be further embedded, a difficult task since policy has no formal benchmark. What does all of this tell us? To deinstitutionalise the patriarchal past and smash the glass ceiling of any museum relies on an active, intuitive curatorship supported by senior staff. But it is going to take time. The outcome is that women will have to wait a while yet to get on the walls and be secured in the art history books. According to staff in the Ulster Museum, they are only at the beginning, but off to a good start.
And now to move to our final presentation. We have work by Kelly Emerson.
Hi, my name is Kelly, and I'm going to talk today about art and the internet. Most of us don't read the terms and conditions when we make an Instagram account. But if you're an artist, maybe you should. If we take a look at Instagram's community guidelines, find a policy that says, we know that there are times when people might want to share nude images that are artistic or creative in nature, but for a variety of reasons, we don't allow nudity on Instagram. It then goes on to say, nudity in photos of paintings and sculptures is okay too. Yet Instagram doesn't always accurately enforce this policy. And what about those art forms beyond painting and sculpture? Well, Instagram is often held up as a great career management tool for artists because they can network and share and sell work. How much can we value Instagram as a tool for artists? Instagram restricts some artists from posting. I found almost no scholarly research on this topic when I began looking into it, so I looked at research on internet law and regulation, art censorship, social media cultural work, and newspaper articles. I became interested in how visual artists perceive Instagram's community guidelines and the effects these guidelines have on visual artists' use of Instagram for career management. To investigate this question, I interviewed 5 visual artists that use Instagram. My participants believed that access to an online community was the most important part of Instagram for career management. My participants were also very concerned with what it means to be an artist on Instagram. Interestingly, when talking about Instagram's guidelines, my participants simultaneously argued that art is too difficult to regulate and that internet spaces need to be regulated. So what does this tell us? First, if Instagram is valued as a means of forming online artistic community, Those artists who have work removed from Instagram are restricted from participating in this community. This is especially problematic for artists from marginalized backgrounds who face additional challenges in accessing the established art world. Second, since Instagram makes an allowance for some forms of artistic nudity, such as painting and sculpture, the platform and its workers are deciding what content fits this description, what content is acceptable art, and what content isn't. Further, if Instagram is supposed to be an egalitarian platform where anyone can share artwork, how does Instagram decide who is and isn't an artist? As long as Instagram limits artistic tastes and expression and passes judgment on what is and isn't art, and consequently who is and isn't an artist, its value as a career management tool for artists is limited. While I'm not arguing that Instagram needs to get rid of its guidelines on nudity, I am arguing that artists and cultural workers need to be critical of viewing Instagram as a tool for career management. In an era where so much of our cultural engagement has to take place online, we need to be critical of what content is valued in these spaces and which voices are excluded. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Tamana and Fiona and Kelly for those thought-provoking presentations. As I said, after this event, we're going to make these available on YouTube. But for the next part of our session, I'm going to introduce this year's keynote. A feature of the annual showcase every year is that we ask an academic, a researcher, to come and speak about a topic that connects to some of the themes that we want to explore. And this year is no different. So I'm going to pass over shortly, but first I'll do a quick introduction to Mark Banks. Professor Mark Banks is, he recently joined the University of Glasgow as Professor of Cultural Economy at the School of Cultural and Creative Arts. But in previous years until 2020, he was Professor and Founding Director of the influential Cameo Research Institute for Cultural and Media Economies at the University of Leicester. He's also worked with the Open University, Manchester Metropolitan College, and his research is principally in the cultural and creative industries, particularly visual arts, music, and media. And he's widely known for his focus on work and employment, participation, and social justice, and the relationship of culture and economy. His current work is concerned with how the cultural industries and the wider creative economy can be made more socially and creatively just and better linked to ecological politics. And some of these concerns of well-being and transitional economies will be touched on in his contribution today. His many publications have garnered international praise and touched on important dilemmas of precarity in cultural work, and the missteps between state organizing policy systems, the rhetoric of the creative city, and the harsh and unequal realities of creative and cultural work. He's also been at the front of new and emerging research speculating how COVID-19 is not only prompting but forcing us to radically rethink how cultural and creative work might happen in the future. So to give his talk today titled Reinventing the Future, Arts and Culture After COVID, I'll pass over now to Mark Banks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ali, and thanks for the invitation to talk today. And thank you to Kelly and Tamana and Fiona for your presentations. As Ali says, what I write about is work and employment in the arts and culture, linked to cultural theory and cultural policy. And what I wanted to talk about today, to share today, was some of the things I've been thinking about and writing about recently around the theme of COVID and the post-COVID cultural economy. And if you're interested in these writings, you can find them on my Glasgow website or on my Twitter feed, or I can share them otherwise. So we know that arts and culture is facing an unprecedented crisis as a result of COVID-19, and cultural workers are really bearing the brunt of this. And while a return to normal is desired by many, I think post-COVID, I would argue that this is not only likely impossible in many ways, but it's also undesirable in others. So the question I really want to ask today is there an alternative for work and economy in the arts and culture, and what might it start to begin to look like? So the adverse impact of the pandemic on the arts and cultural sector is now widely acknowledged, and the collapsing income and employment has been widespread and devastating. And the brunt of the pandemic, the great unequalizer, I think, has fallen quite differently on full-time permanents and insecure casuals, on well-paid arts sector CEOs and the self-employed. And the established patterns of cultural work inequality in terms of class and gender and race and region and disability and so on, all well documented, I think, before the pandemic, have been reinforced. And I think whatever the effect of the UK government's bailout, beyond mothballing what Oliver Dowden called the country's crown jewels, it's fairly safe to say that any recovery may be a long time coming for the ordinary sector, if you like. So this year we saw arts and cultural workers quite quickly relegated to the bottom of the list for priority attention. And this is quite a fall from grace, I think. Only 2 decades ago, culture, which was glamorously rebadged as the creative industries, was set to spearhead a revitalized UK PLC, regenerate our cities, and kind of remake us as the creative workshop of the world. And some of that, I think, clings on in the 2018 industrial strategy, the first since the 1970s, where the creative industries were mainly cast really as part of the UK's emerging high-tech competition with the US and with China. But at the same time as talking up the creative industries, the Conservatives were slashing arts and culture funding, diminishing or undermining the capacity of local authorities to support such activities themselves. And as we've seen, kind of dragged their feet somewhat, a lot really, on the arts relief package, as they gave perceived real jobs in construction, retail and hospitality their rhetorical priority, not those jobs that they've too frequently, I think, stereotyped as being occupied by liberal elites or by left-wing lovies. But I would say that the difficult conditions for those who work in the arts and culture, or those like me and many of us who wish to advance the case for arts and culture from academia, are not simply consequences of the Tory austerity drive or the dismissals of the populist right. But it actually goes back to 2 or 3 decades, really, to the limitation imposed, I think, by a particular kind of creative industries imaginary, which sought to position arts and culture as the creative sector, so-called, and the creative city at the cutting edge of global modernity, post-industrial modernity, if you like. So conceived by in the 1990s by New Labour, this imaginary had quite an influence, I think, on how art and culture came to be valued by the public, by the government, and by industry alike. And inclusion in the 2018 industrial strategy was really the pinnacle of this ambition to establish culture as central to the post-industrial knowledge economy, transforming, if you like, those rebellious energies of the 1970s into the proper jobs of the 1990s and new millennium. But the creative industries had actually emerged really as one of the few explicit continuities between old and new Labour. In London, in Manchester, in Sheffield in the 1980s, amongst local Labour authorities, were sort of cultural industries conceived as a way to combine the new informational economy with popular culture, local popular culture, and with radical and democratic politics that had stemmed from post-1968 social movements. But recast, if you like, in a new guise, in 1998 and beyond, the creative industries offered the prospects of a high-value, innovation-rich, and meritocratic form of employment. This was meant to be for everybody. So the creative industries really helped New Labour establish a kind of hold on the future. So we should be wary, I think, of just dismissing this as purely opportunistic or superficial. the creative industries promised hope, really, after the dislocation of the Thatcher and then the major years, really. They held out real possibilities for new kinds of meaningful work, for self-creation, and for grassroots micro businesses transforming and energizing our cities. And it was seen by many that the creative industries would redeem the liberatory promise of the counterculture, but by working in partnership with the market rather than indulging, if you like, in a kind of patrician disdain or bohemian opposition. But I think by 2008, the shine on this assumption had really already worn off, and the financial crisis really sounded the death knell for New Labour and its unvarnished optimism in this area. But even before the economic meltdown, a lot of local creative clusters, as they were called, and creative ecosystems had always found it difficult to thrive and grow or even sustain, I think, in partnership with core cities or with commercial centres. And even within the metropolises, it was really the gentrified city centres, repopulated in a warehouse and an apartment boom that mainly benefited, and not people in the decaying inner city or the suburbs, if you like. So the extent to which existing or residual or resident populations of cities were gaining from the cultural economy started to be more openly challenged, I think. As someone, I think earlier mentioned Richard Florida, there was an assumption that this was going to benefit everybody equally, and quite quickly it turned out not to be the case. And I think despite the rhetoric, most creative industry growth actually appeared not in grassroots arts and cultural organisations or cultural ecosystems of that kind, but was more generally contained within mainstream IT, communications, in retail and leisure, which largely benefited really the incumbent corporations. But I think the most damning indictment against the creative industries, and arts and culture especially, came in the way they were perceived to treat their workers. People who worked tirelessly for love proved easy to exploit, while working for love in itself became an option only open to the most privileged. And more widely, enforced freelancing and entrepreneurial independence had advantages, but it also helped mainstream the gig economy, which we now, of course, see increasingly absorbed into the networks of what people call platform capitalism. So while cities got their creative makeover, if you like, the main beneficiary was established capital, and labour inequalities in the creative workforce became quite deeply entrenched. And many local cultural economies were left to flounder or sink as cultural regeneration, as it was called, strengthened its grip. But while I suppose New Labour did increase public funding for the traditional arts, especially what's called the GLAM infrastructure, this was accompanied by a kind of punitively bureaucratic KPI regime, increased metrocisation, and a further concentration of funding for the larger metropolitan institutions. And since austerity was imposed in 2010, a lot of that funding has actually, of course, dried up, but the hoops organisations need to jump through to secure it, of course, remain. And I think more generally, then, the pandemic has served to further expose the existing fragility of the kinds of cultural or creative economy most of us here today would wish to work in or support. Most ordinary small and medium-sized arts organisations had already become adapted to surviving on a shoestring or through charity or goodwill, barely subsisting. And for the private sector, while UK governments have offered some targeted aid in the form of tax reliefs, some kind of strategic innovation funds, the state has been largely content to leave small and medium-sized firms, who are of course the majority of employers, to sink or swim really in what has been a decade-long stagnant economy. Meanwhile, I think across all sectors, hyper-flexible cultural labour, already accustomed to a kind of a project-based existence, if you like, has been forced further into this web of discontinuous, uncertain, often wageless work that tends to offer a minimal security and only slim prospects really of an improvement of terms or conditions. And as I've written about and been writing about recently, many workers have already spoken about the difficulties and the traumas inflicted by their sudden and enforced redundancy as a consequence of the pandemic. Across all cultural industries, workers have reported being stressed, out of work, really concerned about the future, struggling to keep their heads above water, wondering whether there are going to be jobs for them in the future. Really expressing what I would call, the complex pains really of economic injury. But when it comes to cultural workers, as for workers elsewhere, of course, while the pandemic might be regarded as an unprecedented event, it could also be seen as an expansion of an established trend, I would say. And if you like, the exaggeration of an apocalyptic mood, I think, since the virus has really helped to amplify some long-standing, long-instituted feelings of precariousness, as well as this inscribed tendency of organisations to sacrifice labour at the first sign of trouble to meet the demands of economic priority. So I would say, in short, cultural workers were already precarious before the pandemic. They're just more precarious now. And the bailout certainly does not serve the majority of people who work in or would wish to work in the arts and cultural sector, as the bailout funds appear at this stage not to come with any particular kind of strings attached. There seems little incentive for the institutions to use that money for anything other than executive preservation, mothballing, maintenance. So how the cultural bailout can therefore be said to represent a generative or a productive investment in the cultural sector, as the DCMS would like to claim, is somewhat hard to say. And how the cultural workforce will survive beyond a very small and privileged core is a further question that the bailout is yet to find an answer for. So what can we do? What can we do to change this, and where can we look for more positive signs of a better economic future? Many of you aim to work in or are already working in the cultural sector, I expect. So what kinds of workplace should you have a right to demand or expect or aspire to? What options are open to those who wish to create their own sustainable organisations or practices? And I think some things we've already learnt in the pandemic can help us start to think through this problem. The first of which is that we now know governments can act quickly, they can spend money when there is a need and a strong public demand. They can mobilise resources, they can institute sweeping interventions to support populations and an agreed greater good. And that they will do this more readily when their own interests and, if you like, the entwined interests of finance are threatened really doesn't need saying, as we saw in the global financial crisis. But unlike a decade ago, there is now an almost universal public demand for government to intervene to protect everybody who's been affected by the crisis. So how quickly such measures of support can or will be rolled back post-COVID is an open question, really. And I guess the scale of the recession to come might significantly determine how this is answered. But COVID has not only brought to an end any fatalistic acceptance of the state as being powerless against the market or unable to act, it's also exposed that austerity was always a matter of choice rather than a kind of unassailable law. The continued efforts recently of hashtag excluded UK freelancers in the cultural industries to draw attention to this is one feature, of course, of the pandemic landscape. For UK cultural workers then, and more cultural workers more widely, of course, we should therefore continue to expect better and demand more from the state. For artists, enhanced social security and welfare supports and a greater protection against economic precarity, at least equivalent to that that's being offered by our close European neighbours, for example, would be one good start. Not the solution to all our problems, but a good start nonetheless. But we might also demand a kind of renewed recognition of the social value of arts and culture. And in this current crisis, cultural workers might not be regarded as essential in the same way as providers of medical care or people who work in the food industry. But as we've already seen, they do bring vitality and value of a different kind. And culture and the arts might well deserve some immediate recognition, I think, for alleviating the negative effects of social distancing and enhancing public well-being. But our ambition can also reach wider, I think. We can extend that further if, as some anticipate, COVID proves instrumental in shifting the ways we think about public value and what kinds of work are vital or essential and which really are not. And if you don't think art and culture and creativity are essential to life, then of course try to imagine a life without them. I probably don't need to convince anyone here of that claim. But secondly, I think finding ways to challenge this precipitous rise in casualised, low-paid work is paramount, as is addressing the lack of social diversity in the cultural sector, as our speakers have just referred to. And I think these concerns have been centre stage for some time now, and of course should remain so. And many academics and journalists and practitioners have drawn attention now to this endemic inequality. But I would say that counting up inequalities is by no means enough. We really need to express a vision or a number of visions of what fair and decent work might actually look like in the arts and cultural sector. A better idea of what I previously called, in some other writing, creative justice. And I think beyond this, at macro level, we must recognise that culture is not just about infrastructure or economy, but is also about imaginaries. And that these all have to work together. And in this, we also need to reaffirm the value of art and culture, not just as something that's commercially valuable and necessary, but as something that's a vital component of expressive life. Something that includes all those texts and artifacts, from video games to pop music to dance, literature, and gallery art, if you like. And thirdly, I think the ending of the creative industry's myth was a collective deflation in many ways, a puncturing of an imaginary, which for all its kind of accelerationist, expansionist overtones, did represent for many people a hopeful vision of the future. But the pandemic has now created a context for us to reimagine that future and the role of arts and culture within it. And the pandemic, and I'd say preceding decade of stagnation and cuts, has given us further occasion to ask once again, well, what kind of economy do we really want? What kind of economy do we really need? And we should certainly be asking the same question of the cultural economy. The answer I've kind of recently given is one that values social rather than personal creation and shared prosperity, and is not simply concerned with competition and copyrights and extractions, one that respects environmental constraints and some emergent, very urgent ecological limits, and one that seeks to eliminate unnecessary suffering, ingrained precarity, and any undue inequity and inequality. And for everyone, art and culture really can be seen as both pleasure and necessity, something we enjoy, but it's also something that delivers certain kinds of need as well. And I think we can take a lead from those who see art and culture as being both part of our communal luxury, if you like, as the writer Kristin Ross calls it, a shared pleasure and a vitality, as well as seeing art and culture as central to the formation of real utopias, as the late sociologist Eric Olin Wright suggested, part of our mundane and practical efforts to find ways just to live together better. And state support, I think, remains vital here, and access to a publicly supported cultural infrastructure is a basic prerequisite for ordinary participation in this shared journey of our democratic life. And having the means to develop a taste for one's own culture, alone or with others, in the home or in public, is a vital freedom, I think, that public infrastructure can help to nurture. And here I think we need to start thinking about new ways of working in culture that encourage mutuality and denounce exploitation. A funded public cultural sector and a private sector, appropriately incentivized but not left unchecked, that can offer a greater variety of models of economic organization, including those that are more equalitarian and sustainable in character. This would be a desirable outcome, I think. Not least because it provides a stronger insurance against future risks and vulnerabilities of the kind that we're currently experiencing. So local and national governments that support cultural co-ops, not-for-profits, social enterprises, forms of mutuality are to be encouraged, I think, not least because state support that's allied to creative ingenuity and social purpose is what really actually makes for a more creative and sustainable economy. And I think this is the true meaning of the good creative city and good creative governance. But it will also, I think, require some work from within. A new approach that might involve cultural leaders and arts managers demonstrating vertical and horizontal solidarities and having the collective courage and the will to resist any imposed return to a painful austerity that really does sell artists and art short, restricts, unfortunately, the widest possible popular participation, and institutes these countless games of competition and beggar thy neighbour. And this is where many people on this programme, I think, can certainly make a difference. And finally, just to finish, I think COVID has given us a moment, a pause to consider what culture itself might be or what it might become in and beyond the immediate crisis. And as we all, I think, have become familiar, people in lockdown have turned to culture and have turned to the arts for some much needed release and comfort and compensation. Culture has helped people get through this crisis so far. So any future value we attach to culture might well be influenced by an appreciation that in this time of crisis, culture really stood up and provided. But I think, while that's good, there's also a danger attached to that. And culture and art may well provide a good distraction from the pandemic or support us through the crisis, but that's not really their only purpose. Because if it was, there'd be no reason for us to give them any thought once the crisis was over. So such a view of culture as being merely public giving might also encourage us to disclaim or overlook our obligations to offer proper compensation to the cultural worker. We have to keep in mind that professional cultural work is not a hobby or a giveaway or something that should be gifted. It should be something that's properly compensated for and rewarded. And culture must therefore continue to provide material livelihoods for workers and better work. But one of the other dangers of this crisis, I think, is that we will lose some of what I would term the objective respect we might have accrued for the arts and culture. That is, we will fail to value cultural objects on their own terms and in the context of the full range of the aesthetic standards and practices that are established by artists and cultural workers themselves. And I think that was what Kelly's presentation was also alluding to. In the pandemic, I think arts for health or well-being or distraction are immensely valuable, but other approaches are also possible and necessary. What about art as protest or as anger or as a dissent or as a challenge to really these terrifying politics of pandemic? And one thing that people are not talking about very often in lockdown discourse is an appreciation of what we would conventionally regard as a core purpose of art and culture, the sustainment of social critique through symbolic means. And popular coverage of the turn to culture in crisis has been quite slow, I think, to signpost or foreground dissident cultural and artistic voices that might be taking societies to task for their dreadful failings. But it's those cultural workers who are doing that, who are brave enough to sustain those critiques, who are going to be as vital as any others in helping us deal with and depart from the devastations of COVID-19. And I would say, finally, that we would do well to contemplate that as well as we try to move forward in and beyond the crisis.
Thank you, Mark. That was really, really interesting, fascinating, useful, so much to think about and to draw from. So this bit is where we move to the kind of questions and answers, the discussion element of today's event. And I'm delighted to just give a quick introduction to Dr. Natalia Grincheva, who's very kindly agreed to chair today's session. So Dr. Grincheva is an Honorary Fellow in Culture and Communications at the University of Melbourne. She has held several prestigious international research awards, including Fulbright, the Quebec Fund, Australian Endeavour, and her research focuses on digital diplomacy with particular attention to new museology and social media technologies. Her work has appeared in a range of international journals, and among her most influential works to date has been the short format book Psychopower of Cultural Diplomacy in the Information Age, which received the 2013 Digital Humanities Research Award. Her extensive list of publications features not one but two books in 2020, concerned with contemporary institutional diplomacy through museum franchising practices and online museum spaces as sites of social activism and digital diplomacy. Most recently, her research interests have been drawn to deep mapping and digital visualization of museum impacts in neighborhoods, cities, and societies, using GIT to develop a digital mapping tool of museum soft power. And the understanding at global and neighborhood level of the connections of cultural and digital, exhibition and diplomacy are what make her an ideal chair for today's discussion. So I'm going to pass over to Natalia now to open up the kind of conversation and discussion. And if people have questions to put into the chat menu or the chat here in the meeting, she'll be able to pick them up. If I could ask our three fantastic presenters from earlier, plus and Mark as well, 4 presenters, to open up your cameras and mics now, that would be really great. And we'll start off.
Thank you so much, Ali, for this very wonderful introduction of me. I'm very delighted to hear so many positive comments. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation and to welcome new students to the program. I think all the projects of former students that were presented today by Kelly, Tamana, and Fiona are really wonderful. And first of all, congratulations, big congratulations to these students who successfully, completed the research projects under the pressure of the pandemic crisis and under the pressure of the digital lockdown. This is just super wonderful, and these are great achievements. I also wanted to comment and thank Mark for his wonderful speech, which was illuminated, very insightful and thought-provoking. But I just wanted to, but I think that it was a little bit negative and pessimistic. And I wanted to encourage all newcoming students who come to the program right now to study arts and cultural management on the new level, not to be discouraged by all the negative consequences which are happening in the arts and cultural sector right now because of the pandemic outbreak, global outbreak. I just wanted to stress that there are still opportunities in the sector, and you are the future leaders. You are the future leaders who should lead that sector and should address all the shortcomings, all the problems, all the challenges that we are facing right now. Also coming from a little bit different perspective in the research of arts and cultural management, because Mark is coming from the economic, political economy kind of trajectory, and my research on new technologies, digital, diplomacy and digital communication. I must say that my current research on contemporary museology under the pressure of the pandemic is actually thriving. There are many new things that are emerging at the moment, new exciting things that completely reshifting the museology sector. And these are all exciting changes. So, and for example, Mark also mentioned, especially right now, the small businesses or small creative arts industries are under a huge, pressure, and there are no economic opportunities. I must say that right now I'm conducting a series of interviews with museums around the world who are using new innovative technologies to advance their reach to audiences, global and local. And they're telling me that they are hiring. They're hiring, freelancers. They're hiring tech-savvy people at the moment. They're hiring small companies who actually bring new talents, new opportunities, new developments in the digital sector to the museum world. So I just wanted to say that this exciting world of arts and creative industries is still huge, it still contains a lot of opportunities. So, and I just wanted to welcome new students to this world. And despite all the odds that are happening and that we are seeing in the sector, there is still opportunities there. So right now, I would like to ask several questions, and I also again invite our audiences to post their questions in the chat. But my first questions to all panelists is about their ideas of their research and the transformation of these ideas under the pressure of the pandemic crisis and the digital lockdown that affected the research design. I would imagine the research methodologies and things like that. So the question is, how did you develop the original idea of your research? And how did this idea transformed, and how many times did it transform throughout the whole research project? And what the role of pandemic was in transforming these ideas? So Kelly, Tamana, Fiona, any one of you are welcome to the floor to share your insights.
I can go, I guess. I suppose I don't really remember where the initial idea for my research came from, but I think it became more relevant as the pandemic began and as we saw all of our cultural activity having to transform and begin taking place online. It really didn't affect my research methodology all that much, since I was interviewing artists that are from around the island of Ireland. I was always going to have to interview some people over the phone or over Zoom. But now I just had to, interview everyone over Zoom or over the phone instead of meeting anyone in person. But I think as the research process went along and the pandemic also went along, it became evident that how we use social media for art is maybe even more important now than it was, or than I thought it was when I started my research.
Will I go now, maybe? Have I got my mute off? Oh, I do. So, so I work for Her Story, which is an organisation that promotes the achievements of women that have been lost to history. So whenever I came to my dissertation, I knew I would always base it on something to do with women. And definitely the process of narrowing that down took me quite a substantial amount of time to learn about the dissertation, and that it has to be a focused area of study. So for me, I was fortunate in that I had my interviews organised just before lockdown came in March. I did have to conduct them over Zoom, or via the phone, because everyone was working from home at the time. The only way it really affected my outcome would be that I was doing a qualitative analysis, and that was the key objective of my case study. However, the staff were going to provide me with a quantitative analysis to accompany this, because we know that statistics are nuanced and it's not going to give you, I was looking for the why in this, which is the qualitative, but I did want to balance it out with that quantitative. However, since staff were working at home, they couldn't go around the gallery and do a count on the wall per se. So we had to take a guesstimate or a guideline of those number of works in the collection. And the museum does not have an exacting number. So that would have been it for me.
For me personally, a lot like Kelly, my interviews are always going to be done through Zoom or online, because I was going to be in Belfast interviewing businesses here in Canada. But the biggest thing that affected me was a lot of these businesses, which are independent, smaller, for-profit ventures, were heavily affected by COVID. And I had somewhat assumed that everyone's kind of at home and they'd have time but just the stress of not knowing whether their business was going to survive through this made it very difficult to ask them to kind of give their input on these strategic plans, which may not even be effective at all because they could not foresee your plan for any of, anything that's happened over the last year.
I guess on a global scale, what I would like to say about women's art is that a lot of exhibitions had been planned for 2020 around the world, like Baltimore had an all-female lineup. And because of COVID, obviously people haven't been able to go and access these exhibitions in person. So obviously, you know, these exhibitions are planned 3 to 5 years in advance. So when we maybe do get a full access again, it's going to be on to the next exhibition, and then maybe this time for women artists will pass. So it's about a matter of putting in something in place that it isn't just those exhibitions that were planned for now. Maybe they didn't make it on time for the 2018 centenary of the vote, and that's why they were planned for 2020, but it's to make sure the time doesn't elapse in between.
So thank you very much for your answers. And as I can see, the majority of you applied qualitative research methods drawing on the interview with different participants. But I just wonder, for the research on the arts and creative industries in the future, what would be your next recommendations for incoming students on looking at other kinds of methods? And I also, expand this question not only to our panelists, but also to Mark. Curious to know his opinion on the quantitative versus qualitative research, during and post-pandemic arts and culture industries, and maybe to highlight a little bit the role of big data and data-intensive research into their arts and creative industries in the future. So I welcome panelists to answer this question, but also I would like to hear from Mark.
Well, the virtual engagement is obviously going to be the main point of research at the minute that will take place during COVID. And it's looking at, for me, it would be key with engagement, who ticks like or who actually comments who, and what do they comment about the events, and an analysis of the comments and the engagements with comments in comparison to likes, and who's tuning in and the demographics of that.
I think for me personally, doing the research that I did through interviewing, it's for me, I kind of find now more than ever, it's so important to be doing this like qualitative research. These people who are being affected by COVID in our industry have a lot of input and have a lot of very important input. And as someone who's still very new in this field, I find that now more than ever, we have to start learning and listening from the experts and from the people leading the industry and the people who have been working in the industry for this long.
Yeah, I agree with both those points. I know when I was formulating how I was going to do my research, Ali and I talked a lot about whether or not I should include visual analysis, and I ultimately went with no. But since so much of our engagement is taking place online and on social media, that's one place that is really open for further research.
Yeah, the only thing I really have to say about that, or to add to that, is I guess questions of method are related to the kind of questions that you want to ask, whether it's qualitative or quantitative method or some other kind of approach that combines the two. Is really driven by the questions. What is it that you want to find out? What is it you're trying to establish? There's lots of opportunities, I think, for creative collaborations between our students and organizations around method, some of which we just heard about. And on the question about tech and big data, again, I'm not very beguiled by the idea of tech and big data solving all our problems. But what I think is it provides possibilities in terms of methodological advance, which we should embrace. But at the same time, fundamentally, any question of method is a pragmatic question. It's a question of what is it that you're trying to find out and how will the tools help you to do that. Certainly currently, and I suspect many, all of the students on this program this year, just like students on our programs, have had real challenges in trying to conduct master's level research, field work under conditions of COVID-19. What I'm sure has happened there, as has happened here in Glasgow, is that students have shown great creativity and resourcefulness in coming with various kinds of ways to circumvent the problems imposed by lockdown. And some of the dissertations this year that I've been reading have been remarkable, actually, in how well students have adapted to the incipient crisis and coming up with ways around some of the restrictions that have been imposed on us. So I'm optimistic about the possibilities of method within and beyond COVID, but all questions of method, as far as I'm concerned, are not a priori. You don't choose your method before you've got your problem sorted out. You work out what the problem is, and then you work out what methods are going to help you to solve that.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much, Kelly, Tamana, and Fiona. And my next question are related to one of the questions that was posted earlier. So I know that the most difficult part for any student in developing their research project is come up with a really good topic and come up with a really good research case study and focus. So maybe could you highlight any topics or research cases that would be on demand in the post-pandemic world that could be used for policy advocacy, for example, or as an evidence of their development of the sector. So all these specific areas in the like a broad and a huge field of arts, cultural management and creative industries, where students might want to focus their attention in developing their research projects. So this question is open for all panelists. Anyone?
Can you just summarize the question again, Natalia?
Yes, yes, I'm asking to maybe highlight particular research areas or research topics or particular cases where students could focus in developing their research project, because for some it's a really huge problem, especially if they don't have experience, professional experience, is to come up with a really good topic to look at and to start researching. So what topics would be on the demand in the post-pandemic world because of the needs of the sector?
Well, okay, I'll go first then. I would really underline what I've just said, really, about the challenges that are going to be faced by people entering this labour market are considerable. And I think we don't necessarily need to deny that or mask that from students. Students increasingly, in my experience, having taught this stuff for 2 decades, are becoming much more interested in issues around labour and work and careers and sustainability, and how they're going to not just learn a discipline or learn how to manage arts, but actually how to sustain a career within a particular kind of context and develop a practice within a wider set of circumstances in which the art world sits. So I think awareness of the reality of field conditions is something that students are becoming much more aware of and involved in. And I think that's good. And I think it helps if you want to go into arts management or a career in the arts, if you're not without illusion, really, about what the nature of the field is like. But what that gives you, I think, is an ability to adapt, and it gives you a kind of a realistic picture of what to expect and allows you to then to make decisions accordingly. So I think students have always shown great ingenuity, I think, in coming up with topics and projects. That's never been a problem. Beyond COVID, I think there is going to be a particular set of challenges that might invite students to look perhaps more critically at the way in which the arts and cultural industries are organised.
I know for my research, once COVID kind of took off there in spring, I probably could have changed my entire topic if it wasn't too late and just be talking to businesses who probably won't make it through, which I know is another, it's negative, but it's just the reality of what they're facing. I know once I did figure out who I was going to interview, one of the businesses before I completed the interview told me that they will be folding and asked if they were still welcome to participate, and absolutely they were. They still had a lot of insight, but that's obviously something that I think is important, especially for people who are interested more in the for-profit arts sector, to kind of be researching of what's going to survive and what's not going to survive.
So if there are no other comments from other panelists, I wanted to read a question from the audience. Derek is asking, so she has a long question, so let me read it. While it feels good to hear that museums are hiring, the fact that they are looking for freelancers, as I pointed out, only reinforces the point Mark has made about the precarity of cultural workers. I work for a cultural organization which has taken the decision to upskill current employees' talents to digitalize its cultural offer rather than outsourcing it. How do our speakers see this as a potential solution to the precarity of cultural workers? So I open this question right now to Mark, Kelly, Tamana, Fiona.
Yes, I think I think the issue in some ways has never been that there are no jobs. I think the issue is around what are those jobs like? What are the quality of those jobs? What do they offer? The museum sector, as which is the question I mentioned, the museum sector is certainly in the UK at least, is one of the lowest paying sectors, and it's a predominantly feminized workforce. So it's most people who work in museums are very badly paid, and most of the workers are women. Museums have historically had a poor record, I think, on things like staff development and retention and exploiting people's love for working in a museum to ensure that they remain at an affordable financial cost. So for me, the issue is around, well, not so much that jobs aren't out there, it's well, what are those jobs going to be like, and how can we improve the quality of them? How can we make people's careers better and more sustainable? The issue around digitization is an important one, I think, and upskilling is something that historically museums have not done well with its workforce. So I think it's a good thing that museums are being kind of proactive in various kind of ways, trying to build the skill level of their employees, trying to embrace new technology for advantageous means. But as long as that's kind of built around a kind of a holistic model, I think, around trying to kind of develop the value of the museum in various kinds of measures, I think then that can be a good thing. The risk, of course, is when organizations digitize, that can then be used as a way to kind of substitute ineffectively for labor. And when that happens, I think that's more of a problem.
I think the fact that they are upskilling their employees, and I don't know if they're paying for it, I assume that they're paying for this on their behalf, it's laudable. However, it seemed in the overall grand scheme of the arts, it's like it's putting a lovely sticky plaster over a wound, and there is a deeper problem that needs to be resolved. I know it cannot be within the short space of time, and as I say, it's a good solution for now. But the fear would be that people then take those digital skills and go elsewhere where they are going to get employment, where they're going to get better conditions of work. So it needs more than a sticky plaster.
I also feel it's not a solution for the arts across the board. The way museums work and a lot of the stuff that I've been kind of seeing in more of the performing arts, live music and live theater, the margins to make money off of live streaming is just not the same. And it's okay right now as they're trying to work it out, but it doesn't seem to be a long-term solution at all. So it's kind of hard not to be negative about it, but even with everything going digital, it just doesn't seem like the only solution and necessarily the best solution that they have to come up with.
So thank you very much for your answers. And I also wanted just to comment, it's not the trend that to make everything digital. It's the trend that before the COVID, digital wasn't optional. That was just an option for many organizations, including museums. Right now, it's a must. And the trend is to going for more hybrid experiences, digital plus physical. It's like after the COVID, there will not be only digital culture or digital sector or digital museums. There will be a hybrid, and the increase in the digital technologies will facilitate this, new hybrid experiences for the audiences. So again, just wanted to stress that I come from a completely different perspective, how I look at the sector. So right now, we do not have more questions from the audience, and maybe we wrap up our panel by collecting one piece of advice from each of the panelists to the new students for developing their new projects. So I would like to ask you to think, what was the biggest challenge you faced in your research project, and what piece of advice will you give to new students that are challenged to develop their new projects as a part of their curriculum or coursework for the master program?
I can start there. I think most importantly, pick a topic that you know you'll be passionate about. And even if you do that, there's going to be times where you absolutely hate it and it's not going to be fun. But if you do pick something that you are passionate about, that you feel could help or make a difference, it'll make it a lot easier and feel a lot more worth putting in the effort and the work to get it done.
I agree with that, Tams. And I also think it's important to get your ethics in really early if you can, especially if you're going to be doing interviews, anything that involves participants, you have to have ethics approval. And you need time to do those interviews, to set up the interviews, to get people to respond to your interview requests or your survey requests. So you really need to get it done early.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, narrow your focus before you begin the project, because you want to start with a smaller mountain than a really, really high mountain that you've got to climb. So make a good plan, know where you're going, but don't worry about the outcome or your conclusion, because you can't predict that. And that's part of the joy, is finding that new outcome that's unprecedented.
And I just see in the chat that there is still a question for Mark from Deborah Williams. So she wanted to thank Mark for his insights as someone in the industry. The tone was about right, in particular where the diversity inclusion space collide. She wants to ask what Mark sees for the future of research and industry crossover in this specific space.
Yeah, I think I see that in positive terms. I think historically, if I understand the question right, the crossover between research, academic research, and industry practice has been slow to develop, but I think in line with the last decade, where the theme of work and employment representation, participation in cultural industries has become much more of a visible, urgent political topic. There has been quite a growth, I think, of interest in research in this area, but also crossovers and collaborations between academics and practitioners. I guess we're at an interesting phase where a kind of a critical point, I suppose, where I guess I don't want to kind of crudely stereotype industry approaches, but getting industry to recognize that many of the problems that are contained within the industry around low pay, low levels of representation of various kinds of minorities and so on, is not a problem that can be solved through individual endeavor or through people trying harder or through people pulling themselves up to some kind of liberal norm about the entrepreneurial individual, but might actually involve something more systemic being required, more transformational. It has been quite a slow process, I think. But at the same time, getting academics to recognize that theoretical models of how to improve the landscape for the landscape of inclusion, if you like, is much more than a kind of theoretical exercise. Has also been quite difficult. And I think for me and some of the people I've worked with and I've been involved with, I think it's important to think in the future about more transformational interventions that can affect a greater inclusion rather than, if you like, the more traditional empowering interventions, which were much more about correcting individuals and their behavior. So thinking about how industry and research can come together to think, I think, more systemically, more structurally is really the future, and where gains might well be made, something that might affect a more systemic change than we've had previously. And I think just listening to Kelly and Tamana and Fiona and from what I am about my own students and the programs we teach, this is something that has become much more of an issue, an interest for a wide variety of people who are entering the arts management field and the arts and the cultural industries more widely, not just something that's marginal or an add-on or secondary, but something that's now needs to be much more ingrained within the whole discourse and the whole set of practices that we bring to arts and culture and arts and cultural industry going forward, I think.
Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much, Kelly, Tamana, and Fiona. So I think the panel is over at the moment, and I think it was a very rich discussion with different opinions, and I just give the floor back to Ali.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalia. And so it's nearly 3 o'clock. We said we would finish the event. I'd like to extend my thanks to Mark, to Natalia, to Kelly, to Fiona and Tamana for giving your time and giving your views and thoughts so generously today. I'd like to thank you all for attending and contributing kind of questions and ideas. It's a really rich discussion. I agree with what Mark has said. I actually think that there are huge convergences appearing in terms of where the future of kind of labour equality and what kind of work we make in the future connects with research. I think there are really interesting opportunities, and certainly seeing that in the students coming through the programmes and their interest in issues of justice and fairness and equality would give me hope. And just to finish, to say thank you very much. We were helped in terms of getting the students and their presentations ready this year by Thrive, who are an independent not-for-profit agency based in Northern Ireland. And just to say thanks to them, they worked really well with the students who all worked really, really hard to get ready for today. I'd like to thank them, and I'd also like to thank our Queen's Policy Engagement team who've given us massive technical support in terms of having this event on. Not perfectly, from my point of view, but blame me. And then also thanks to the ARSRC, there are events on all week as part of the Festival of Social Sciences, and I would encourage you to go to them all. There will be one on Thursday that I have a vested interest in promoting, which will be an event with Yanis Soulakis, who I'm currently working with, which touches on some of the same topics of today. And just to thank all the Masters in Arts Management students who were coming out of this 2019-20 year. You saw 3 of them. There were many, many, many more, and many of whom are here today. And well done, guys. And we will see you all soon. And hopefully we'll look forward to the next event. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ali, and bye-bye.
Bye.